What's up, phytophiliacs? It's your boy, the Yuri Samosh of sucking toes. Actually, Yuri Samosh probably sucks toes anyway. He looks a little bit of a freak. Super intense dude, too. But I'm Jack Slack, and it's the Fights Gone By podcast, episode 94. It's been a hot minute since the last time we did this. We were talking about Jose Aldo's triumphant return to MMA. Today, we'll be performing a career eulogy for Mighty Mouse, which I will be putting in the thumbnail and implying that the whole episode is about how badly he lost, just to bring in the angry clicks. But no, we'll be catching up on that. We'll be talking about all the stuff going on. We'll be doing some questions. There's not a UFC event this weekend. There's a PFL event if I wanted to follow PFL, but I trust that most of you don't, so I would be wasting my time. But first we'll do some news. And for once, the news is actually pretty exciting. Plenty of moving and shaking about to happen in the upper levels of the lightweight division, which is the most exciting division in MMA and has been for some time. They just seem to have finally put some stuff together in quick succession, which should make for a really interesting few months. So obviously Conor McGregor versus Khabib Nurmagomedov has been booked for UFC 229, which, of course, is in Las Vegas. Despite all that, he wants Khabib in Russia bollocks. Nobody actually wants to go to Russia. Khabib probably does, but the thing that always happens whenever we talk about this, like, mega fight in fighter's hometown, when they're from halfway across the world from America, is that we realise, oh wait, the entire market for pay-per-view is American. So why would I take it to a completely different time zone where I'd either had to put the fight on in the middle of the night or, you know, the early hours of the morning or midday or something in order to actually get those people to buy it? Because the Russians have RU Tracker. They're not buying anything. You can make them stay up till like 5 a.m. for the main event like they did with us with Bisping versus Henderson, which was the biggest slap in the face because nobody gave a shit about that event. It was just to have Michael Bisping in front of a home crowd, and then they were like, but, you know, fuck you too. So, yeah, don't expect a big fight in Russia anytime soon. They might take a fight night event out there, but they're not going to do a pay-per-view there. Rest of that card at the moment is looking shit. Michelle Waterson versus Felice Herrig. Cool, that's an exciting fight in 2008. Lena Landsberg versus Yana Kunitskaya. Ryan LaFleur versus Tony Martin. Oh, and Ovince improved his fight in Dominic Hayes, which should be good. Oh, and Sergio Pettis versus UCF Formiga. But those fights are not going to attract attention. I'm always fascinated to see how they deal with Conor McGregor's fights, because McGregor is such a draw that you could just lazily put him on a shit card. Like the card below DJ and TJ last week or whenever that was, UFC 227, sucked from like the co-main down, with the exception of Swanson versus Moicano. But again, that's a bit of a hardcore fight. Actually, which brings us on to our next piece of news, because Kevin Lee is now petitioning the UFC for a fight on that card against Anthony Pettis. Obviously a nice fight for him because Anthony Pettis is something like 2-8 in his last 10. But Pettis is good off his back, so, you know, that's always an interesting one against a strong top player like Lee. But the point is obviously to get a win on the same card as McGregor and be like, I'm the next logical contender. But if you remember, when Khabib fought Michael Johnson, was that Eddie versus... I think that was Conor versus Eddie in New York. Khabib fought Michael Johnson. That's two top 10 lightweights, you know, with your very, next obvious contender for a title shot there. And they slapped him on the undercard. You know, put him on the main card, have him there so that everyone sees it before the McGregor fight, and they go, oh, but how would McGregor hold up against that lad from earlier? The only people who were saying that were people who, you know, filed in 4 hours early and sat in an empty arena watching Khabib maul someone. It's always weird how the UFC does that. They really need to rethink their timings on that stuff. The other big lightweight announcement was that Nate Diaz is allegedly returning to the cage to fight Dustin Poirier at UFC 230, I think it is, in November. So there you go, folks. It paid off. He just inactivity'd himself into a number one contender fight against a probably far more favourable opponent than someone like Tony Ferguson, and certainly more favourable than Khabib. Because Nate Diaz hasn't improved in years. He just brings the chin and the 1-2 and a decent ground game and the pace. But then Poirier is can get drawn into exchanges too often and is a bit chinny. So, it's always possible that Nate Diaz swoops in to steal Tony Ferguson's rightful shot at the winner of McGregor versus Khabib Nurmagomedov. And of course, Ferguson was announced to be cleared to train and fight again this week, which is super early for a full knee like surgery and everything. People were talking about the similarities with the Dominic Cruz situation. He came back to training too early, blew out his knee. I think Shogun blew out his other knee by overcompensating and after coming back to training too early. But there's a storied history of reoccurring knee injuries in MMA. However, there is now talk of having Tony Ferguson train up and be in shape to take over should McGregor or Nurmagomedov get injured. Of course, that would be Nurmagomedov that got injured. If there's one thing that you can say about Conor McGregor, in spite of all the douchey stuff and the insufferable fan base, he does always turn up. He'll turn up injured, and guys make excuses about losing to him, like Chad Mendes came off the couch and so on. But McGregor has taken last-minute opponent changes often enough that you've got to respect that about him. What else is going on? Oh, $28 million came from an investment group and was pumped into PFL. PFL is quietly ticking along. The fights have been fairly good. I've watched a couple of them. The ratings have not been great at all, and they are allegedly going to be paying out $1 million to one of their fighters or several at the end of this season or whatever. They're basically trying to do what the IFL did, but not as badly. And I loved the IFL, to be fair. But the thing is that they are a company that has failed once under the World Series of Fighting banner, lost all their good fighters in the form of Justin Gaethje and Marlon Moraes, and then rebranded with another influx of cash. Shady cash, we'll add, because, it was... I love Ray Safo, but Ali Abdulaziz has been fairly involved in it, or was involved with it when it was WSOF, and just the whole thing is super shady. And I made a joke about, you'd be better off splitting that $28 million into cash, putting it in 56 piles, and then burning one at a venue each Friday night and charging a gate. And people were like, oh, why do you hate PFL? Well, no, just any investment in MMA generally is a terrible idea. How many fight companies have not failed? It's the UFC, and maybe you could have some of the regional players like Cage Warriors or, some of those small shows. But anyone who gets close to being like a second-tier promotion spends a load of money trying to become a first-tier promotion or compete with the UFC, and then they just collapse like a flan in a cupboard. So if you do come into $28 million, don't invest it in MMA, would be my number one suggestion. Copy my investment model, which is the model of pessimism, whereby I invest it in something that I'm morally opposed to, like private prisons, and then, if I lose the money, that's for the greater good, and if the world keeps getting worse, at least I make money out of it. You can have that advice for free. Another interesting bit of news out of the UFC, Glaucus Tebow has been released after 20-something fights with the UFC. Glaucus Tebow has been around forever. In fact, most people have quietly forgotten that he really stumped Khabib Nurmagomedov back in 2012. That is, every one of these undefeated records tends to have a fight that could not have been undefeated had the judges not been favourable that night. The Glaucus Tebow Khabib Nurmagomedov fight, I wouldn't recommend watching it unless you really don't like Khabib Nurmagomedov. But basically, Glaucus Tebow has always been incredible at stuffing takedowns. He is enormous for his weight. Basically, master of the weight cut, and he just stuffed all of Khabib's takedowns. They both landed 30-something strikes. Glaucus Tebow landed 2 more, and actually scored a takedown at one point. But the judges gave it to Nurmagomedov. Most people were pretty unimpressed with Nurmagomedov in that fight, but luckily he's gone on to smash some really top guys since. But it's interesting to see, because obviously Khabib is getting better, but his wrestling has always been very, very good. And it was interesting to see just how much trouble he got himself in when the man could stop his wrestling, basically. So very sad for Glaucus Tebow, but I think he was on a streak of 4 losses. And also a positive test in one of those losses. It was a submission over Abel Trujillo back in 2015, but then he got caught with erythropoietin, which sounds like a Canadian dish involving gravy. But yeah, those last 4 fights, rough, choked out by Tony Ferguson. And he before that, he had a couple of split decisions too, so he's been on the way down for a while. Michael Johnson stopped him. Islam Makhachev knocked him out, and Makhachev's a grappler, really, more than anything. And his last 2 losses came after 3 years off because of that suspension. Well, 2 years off because of that suspension. Actually, no, only a year and a bit because it's November and January. Ignore what I said there. But yeah, I mean, a little bit sad because he has been around in the UFC since 2006. So he's really like an institution in the UFC. So good luck, Glaucus Tebow, with whatever you do, and I hope that at some point it stops being fighting. Final little bit of news, Derek Lewis versus Volkov is booked for event that I didn't write down, but that's a decent fight. At least Lewis won't be terrified to step in, and Volkov pretty good on the counter, to be honest. So yeah, I quite like that. And it's sort of, Volkov, I wouldn't object to him being put into a title shot, to be honest. But the feeling is that this Brock nonsense is going ahead, so, whatever. Right, let's talk about those fights that happened that I wasn't actually here for. The UFC 227 card was not anything to write home about, apart from racist Ricardo Ramos. But he's not actually racist, his name's just hilarious. But, I mean, there was that Danielle Taylor fight. I mean, has she ever had an interesting fight? But Jose Torres had a good fight with Alex Perez. Aside from that, the Renato Moicano versus Cub Swanson tilt was fairly decent. Moicano was landing his good low kicks. Cub Swanson was trying to swing on him. And then a good stiff left hand. I think it was a jab, but like it snapped Swanson's head back. So it wasn't really like a jab. It was the old straight jolt and knocked him down. Took top position, finished him with a rear naked choke in round 1. I mean, it was pretty much what I expected, Moicano working the long kicks at range and the long straight punches up the middle of Swanson's swings. Because Swanson, while he's always been a very entertaining banger, not always the best technical boxer in that he relies a lot on like lead left hooks. He'll throw a right kick to the shin and then leap in with a left hook off it. He's a bit, the other one that he does a lot is left hook to the head and using the momentum to raise the left kick to the side of the body or the leg. Bit of a wild man. So funky little combinations and setups and things, but not a lot of the not a lot of the veg that you need, alongside that meaty and sugary stuff that he's got going on there. And a nice broccoli straight left just ruined his night. But the main event and the co-main event were the ones that were particularly interesting. I think we'll talk about the main event first because it was shorter and weird. Fuck me, did Cody Garbrandt look bad in this fight. I mean, he still cracked TJ a couple of times. TJ's got a good chin on him, but I wouldn't want him relying on it that much. I wrote a big breakdown for Unibet. It was pretty well received, actually. It was a pretty big piece and one of my favourites that I've written in a while. But I talked about how Cody, certainly in the first fight and through his pre-TJ career, had a tendency to stand still, drop his hands and bring his head up when he was throwing more than one punch and getting into trades. I think he looks really good. We've always said he has a great jab that he never uses. Like when he was going, I'll knock him out with my jab, I was going, yes, please try and do that actually, because you've got a really good jab and you never use it. But he has a really good jab and he works really well in sort of like, he can beat TJ to the punch because he's got much crisper, faster, sharper boxing technique. But he does leave himself wide open in exchanges and get sort of overeager to hit people. And that's exactly what happened. It was absolutely bizarre. He came out, he'd cracked TJ a couple of times, but then he ran at him. I think he got cracked with something first, but then he threw his right hand. TJ shoulder rolled and countered with the right hand. He threw his right hand again and the same thing happened. Then he threw it again and got knocked down on the... he took 3 identical counters in quick succession. It was really weird. It reminded me of that guy who fought CB Dollaway. When we were pretending CB Dollaway had suddenly learned to box because he awkwardly shoulder rolled against that awful guy from Brazil, where the guy put him on the fence, threw a right hand, ate a right hand, threw a right hand, ate a right hand, threw a right hand, fell down as he ate a right hand, and he was gradually losing consciousness but tried the same thing over and over again. Super weird. But Dillashaw looked good, kicked as often as he did in the first fight. Garbrandt didn't look to be dealing with the kicks nearly as well. That's why one of the things that made me think what has happened to this guy's striking / camp, because that's obviously an ongoing thing. They keep firing their head coach, which seems to be a Uriah ego thing. But in the first fight, read the article for this, because in the first fight, whenever TJ kicked, Garbrandt would withdraw, and TJ would kick across himself, and then Garbrandt would be able to try and jump back in afterwards and crack him from a slightly dominant angle. Or he would have TJ thinking that he was going to withdraw by withdrawing all these times, and then he would stand still and try and come up the centre with the left hook as the kick hit his braced leg. Or he would parry things across his body. The teep really got, front kicks generally, really got TJ in trouble in that fight. Garbrandt would parry them across and try and crack him. And none of that turned up in this second fight. TJ kicked, Cody did nothing, and then Cody started swinging. Really bad fight for Cody Garbrandt. And this has always been the playoff between Garbrandt's banging and Garbrandt's actually nuanced technical stuff. Because coming into that Dominic Cruz fight, a lot of what Cardi G had been doing, which is what I'm calling Cody Garbrandt now, it was just sort of running dudes down and blasting them. And you're going, I know this guy can box because I've seen flashes of it against Brimage, but he's just sort of sprinting at dudes. And then against Dominic Cruz, he was just flawless. He was always in his stance. He was drawing the guy forward. He was countering him as he overstepped and lunged in with those herky-jerk walking punches. And then he goes back to fighting like this. The dude has real discipline problems within the fight. Obviously, the discipline to be a fighter and to train as much as he does is all there. But within a fight, he sees red and just goes berserk. So a real shame. He blew his shot at the title. He's never going to get another one unless they bring in Dominic Cruz and Dominic Cruz beats Dillashaw again, which is probably what they'll try and do. They would rather pull the guy off commentary who's been out of action for a year or more than give poor old Rafael Assunção a shot at the belt. Now they've got Marlon Moraes, who's a nice middle ground between exciting guy. Well, actually, Dominic Cruz isn't really an exciting guy, but he's a nice middle ground between known name and underground fan type, and he's got a couple of knockouts, which is a massive advantage in these lower weight divisions. But let's talk about that co-main event then. Demetrious Johnson loses his belt emphatically, gets his ass spanked by Henry Cejudo. Please leave me your angry comments. No, it was a good close fight. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed actually caring about a flyweight title fight rather. Because Demetrious Johnson, I've said this before, but 60-70% of the guys he's fought in title fights probably shouldn't have been there, For everyone, for every long-running champion, there's a couple of those. Dan Hardy probably didn't deserve his title shot against George St. Pierre. Matt Serra didn't, but then he won. So, but more than half of Demetrious Johnson's have been like that. You got the guys who were rushed, Kyoji Horiguchi. You could maybe put Cejudo's first shot in that category. But you got the guys who were rushed, like Kyoji Horiguchi, Ali Bagautinov. But then you've got the guys who just didn't have enough wins, really, to justify it. But then you've got guys who just were really puzzling to get in there. Like Ray Borg had nothing but controversial wins recently. Wilson Hayes had just scraped by Ulka Sasaki on the undercard. Chris Carriasso, Jesus Christ. John Moraga, some of these are just bizarre. But this was a really good fight. I thought Cejudo looked good, and I thought Demetrious Johnson looked good dealing with a good guy. Compared to just steamrolling guys who have these one-dimensional games, like Hayes and Borg, he actually looked thoughtful. He had to adjust. He didn't look as dominant as ever because he was fighting a guy who had rounded skills. And in Cejudo, the improvement between his first fight and this fight was incredible. And I was writing something about it and then I got bored and didn't, as in Cejudo's improvement. But this was in the pre-fight when I was like, I just don't give a shit. But Cejudo has improved and you could see it. Against Benavidez, he came out in that wider stance and he got into a scrappier fight and lost a decision, which, it was a close one, but wasn't as close because he got docked a point for 2 groin kicks in the first round. But then he fought Wilson Hayes and really showed that beautiful karate boxing stuff, and then he fought Sergio Pettis, just wrestle banged him, and then this fight, and I thought he looked great. One of the things, if you want to go back and enjoy watching this stuff, one of the things that's really, really useful for Cejudo is that spiraling towards the inside of the leg. And you can see it in this fight against Johnson, and it never works quite as it's supposed to, but it does set up other stuff. So we talked about that open angle, that open side counter, which is where you draw them into overextension in like a southpaw versus orthodox stance, or the other way around, so open guard position. You draw them into overextension and you fire over their rear hand from like that little angle inside of their front foot. Some folks call it an inside counter because you're moving to the inside of their front foot. Some folks call it an open side counter because you're firing into the open side of their body. Same thing, really. But by every time Wilson Hayes or DJ, he did the same thing to him. Every time they came forward, he would step back and then he would step back off to his right if he was in an orthodox stance and they were in a southpaw, or his left if they were in a southpaw stance and he was in an orthodox. Was that the other way around? But he would step off to the open side. And that like step back and then circle off draws guys out, especially in MMA. You can get them to overextend. But like Wilson Hayes did overextend a couple of times, didn't really suffer the counters, but what he did do was he kept having to turn to face Cejudo. And by knowing where that lead foot is, because the lead foot plants when you pivot, by knowing where that lead foot is, you can go from the inside, and as they're turning, you can step outside their lead foot and thread that right hand down the center or the left hand down the center, depending on which stance you were both on, or step in with a knee up the middle. The basic southpaw stuff, where you step outside of their lead foot and you shoot the straight down the center. And that stuff can be set up by trying to get to the inside angle and then having them turn and jump outside, straddle that leg while they're doing it. So he was trying to do that again. Well, that's how he knocked out Hayes, or knocked him down or whatever. But he was trying to draw Johnson out and crack him with counters. And it's a nice thing to do because it's, Cejudo was always mad about his boxing, but it was really just Superman punches. But by drawing guys on, he can throw counter punches. He landed a couple of good little counter combinations, landed some good body shots in this fight. And Johnson quickly realized that he shouldn't be chasing with punches. And he found the one thing that was working was the low kick, and he just went to that over and over again. Now, this really hacked me off because always the low kick has worked well against Demetrious Johnson. Let's not pretend he's got a flawless style where nothing can be done. He uses his feet so much that he will never stand on one leg and check a kick. He relies on trying to get out of the way. And if he's already in motion, you can try and catch those legs. Cejudo in the first fight landed 2 good low kicks by catching him circling along the fence. Wilson Hayes landed like 14 out of 16. DJ doesn't do anything about low kicks. And you can be like, well, he'll just take them, which is what people were doing about Aldo when he was, checked or avoided 0 low kicks against Frankie Edgar over 2 fights. And you're like, well, no, that's not really an option. Like, nobody can just stand there and take them forever. But that has always been a thing. And Cejudo in this fight landed, I think it was 4 of 6, but he threw almost no leg kicks. Like, the other guy is kicking the shit out of your legs and you don't throw any back. He was throwing kicks, he was throwing like body kicks and trying to land head kicks, but one of the constant features of Demetrious Johnson's style is, even if you're reluctant to be like, well, you might not hurt him with low kicks, slowing people down, kick him in the legs. 1, it might bruise them up and slow them down a bit, but 2, if they want to deal with the low kicks and they have to check them, or they want to try and step up inside them, they have to slow down to do that, and then you can try and hit them with your hands. So that was kind of annoying. But he did use the drawing DJ in to set up nice inside trips, which he got out of the clinch. It was the same inside trip he landed again in the first fight. Obviously, it's been money for him in his entire wrestling career. He did the same thing to Pettis dozens of times, but those were really nice. And if you saw, much like the first fight, Demetrious Johnson immediately tried to create a scramble off the ground, which is a really good way to sort of not get stuck, not get tired out, not get laid on, and to use their momentum to try and carry them over and get up. So he had a butterfly hook, and he tried to underhook the leg as he was falling to his back. And Cejudo immediately slapped on the crossface and just smashed down into him. The thing about reaching underneath people's legs is that you do expose that crossface. If you don't know what the crossface is in this context, it's like the shoulder of justice. It's where you I lost a piece of my tooth, actually, to some shoulder pressure. But I thought that was really good by Cejudo. He didn't actually manage to pass very well off the crossface, but he did manage to use it several times because Johnson was diving under his legs and leaving his head open. Actually, one of the in personal experience, like that's one of the first things that I learned to do against good, like brown and black belt guys when trying to pass the guard. If you just squat over their guards, sit on one of their feet, basically in like a squat, they will try and reach under you, and then you can try and crossface them and just fall on their legs. The crossface is a really powerful position, but it's quite tricky to get into because most guys are consciously fighting off the crossface the entire time. If you watch like the Danaher Death Squad guys, their entire bottom game is like, don't let the other guy touch your head at all. But another thing that Johnson was doing that was really nice was in the middle of these little scrambles off takedowns, he was trying to get to his knees and then try and stand up, and then he'd roll through on the Granby. If you do Granby rolls in any context in MMA, you're my boy. And he lost his title, so he can now be my boy. I thought this was a terrific fight. I thought Johnson found something very simple that was working for him, and then Cejudo didn't actually deal with it very well. If you saw, compare Cejudo with the Machida boys. The Machida boys stand in the same stance. They know that lead leg's there, but they are very good at stepping up the middle and threading the right hand down the center. A collision, we're always talking about creating collisions. I have to make a creating collisions t-shirt, but that sen no sen, that intercepting counter. Cejudo doesn't have that. If you saw when he was getting low kicked, and the same thing happened in the Pettis fight, he was eating a low kick, his leg would go in, and then he would flap his lead arm down to catch the kick on his leg and try and throw the overhand coming back. But it was like a two-part motion. He'd been turned away by the kick connecting, and then he'd try and get back in as they were recovering the leg. Whereas Machida, it's as the opponent comes in, you slam down the center of that kick. It's just something that he doesn't really have the timing on yet. So that would be something, like, clearly he's working with someone who's got like a traditional background in some kind of point fighting. To be working from this stance and using this sort of style. If he just drilled that, for a rematch, that would be an amazing thing to have in the toolbox. So what else happened? JJ Aldrich versus Polyana Viana and Thiago Santos versus Kevin Holland on the main card. What the fuck is this pay-per-view? So that'll sum up just the rant about UFC 227. But there's all this outrage now, like, Demetrious shouldn't have lost, and you're like, it was a good close fight. Who gives a shit? You got a great close fight out of Demetrious Johnson. That's what we've been waiting for someone to do for ages. Rematch, I would love to see. Love a rematch. Dillashaw versus Garbrandt, I mean, you've blown it, son. You don't get a rematch, sadly. But I can see Garbrandt beating some other people and sort of hanging around the top, waiting for a change of title to get an immediate title shot at the next champion. But like that's the thing about this rematch we were talking about. When you rush dudes into these rematches so quickly, when you could build them over like a year with Garbrandt fighting some guy he's going to beat or some top contender, that would have been huge. But this was just like, are we doing that again so quickly? And fans don't actually like this stuff. Like, do you remember Lawler versus Hendricks 3 they wanted to do? And we were like, no, can we have Lawler versus McDonald, please? And then Dana White was like, oh, okay, fine. We've decided to do what you guys are asking for. We're doing McDonald versus Lawler. And we got an amazing fight out of it. But they just wanted to keep running back the same thing over and over again. And the fans are like, well, I'm not going to buy this. Who do you think's going to buy this? I think there's a lot of, it's a dangerous game. Because if you give people fights between rematches, they could always lose. But I think more time between rematches is a nice way to create more interest. You've got time to build it up. If the other guy wins, if the guy who lost the title fight or whatever wins his next match, you go, oh god, he's looking better than ever. I can't wait to see that rematch. If he loses his next match, he can always go and win his next match and set up a rematch later down the road. But the guy who just beat him is instantly in the title picture, and you've justified it. And you're like, oh my god, look at this guy. It's that constant struggle to get eyes on more people than just the 3 or 4 that seem to be catching on with the public at any time. Anyway, I've rambled about that enough. Let's do some questions. The Eric Esch of the Late Night Sesh. Dear Jack, great podcast and all that. What are your preferred ways of avoiding being hit with leg kicks? I read one of those famous boxing books, I think it was John Sullivan. He prioritized completely avoiding getting hit with punches by rolling or slipping them. The next best thing was parrying them, and after that, blocking them, and of course, the worst was to get hit clean. Is the same true for low kicks? One would assume that getting out of the way is better than checking them, but by getting out of the way, you are backing off, which seems a bit like timidity. Is eating a leg kick to land a solid right hand a decent strategy, or is that quite amateurish? Also, is there any chance of Prince Nazim / Brendan Ingle / Harold Graham history episode? Maybe for December. I really liked the Floyd Patterson one. And the thing I've got here seems to have cut off this person's name. So thank you, person. Yeah, I firstly on the history episode, yes, Brendan Ingle died the other day, and that was very sad for me because I always planned to eventually get up to Sheffield and do some training on his weird system of lines. He patented a load of lines that he painted down the centre of this. I think it was a church hall originally, but his youth club, and whether it was the little kids coming in or Naz, Harold Graham, his world-class fighters. What was his name? Ryan thingy. He had Junior Witter. He had a few guys that were world champions or British champions, and they'd come in and they'd do exactly the same thing next to the kids. Fascinating guy. Taught people to hit off both stances. A lot of that was apparently Harold Graham. There was this argument over who came up with it, but Ingle certainly taught a lot of people to do it. Very interesting team. And of course, the split up between Prince Nazim and Brendan Ingle pretty much coincided with Prince Nazim's game going to shit. You can watch Prince Nazim against is it Steve Williams? Dr. Death? No, the guy down in Wales. When Nazim wins his first world title, or actually might have been his second, his featherweight title, whatever. He goes down to Wales and they're all chanting, "Who are you? Who are you?" They hate him down there. And he boxes. Brendan Ingle lists it as like Nazim's best fight. He says he boxes exactly how I taught him to. Left stance, right stance, feet square. He's boxed left stance, side on, left stance, squarer, right stance, side on, right stance, squarer, and then feet level at one point. It's an incredible fight. You can see him setting up hundreds of different things, and he's a really smart boxer in that fight. And then when he leaves Brendan Ingle, he starts working with Emmanuel Stewart, who is obviously a tremendous coach, but has no idea what to do with this guy who, in his view, can't box the way he wants to, the way he should box. It's that thing, like, even the best coaches in the world, if they don't know you, they're going to try and, it's very tricky, because if you start changing things, you ruin stuff. And by the end of it, Nazim Hamed was just jumping in with corkscrew uppercuts and missing and throwing one punch at a time. Which is such a contrast to his early career. That's not like level of competition makes you forget how to use combinations and setups. That's he thought he could just knock people out in one punch. Anyway, sorry, your original question was about low kicks. Yeah, there is a sort of hierarchy of... in any blow, like the hierarchy defensively is the best is avoiding it, the second best is misdirecting it or redirecting it, and the worst is probably blocking it. Well, I mean, the worst is taking it, but that's not defensive. But the worst is blocking it. And even there's levels to that. Like, if you block someone's punch by stuffing their bicep or throwing your arm over their shoulder so that your forearm and elbow block their bicep, that's a lot better than if you're blocking with your guard right by your head, where they've got all that room to build up momentum. So where you block the strike also is basically a hierarchy. However, avoiding, you can do the Machida thing of avoiding everything by stepping straight back. There's not a single technique in the, bare-handed arsenal that works if the opponent steps back far enough. All of them can be diffused that way. Problem is getting back in to capitalize on it. And that's the point of like parries and stuff. Why would you parry something if you can just pull your head straight back or step straight back or move off to the side? The idea of parrying something is that you can then come in on the same line. You parry a jab with your right hand, and then you immediately throw a right hand, a right straight, and then come in with a left hook after it or something like that. Or you parry a right straight with your left hand and come back in with your right hand. It's being able to get in close, and you're sort of redirecting something so that you can move into the space that it was in. With low kicks, low kicks typically, we're talking about round low kicks, but straight low kicks are a little bit different because you could parry those. But parrying low kicks is a tricky business. Parrying round kicks to the head and body is much more doable because you take it on the arm, scoop the other arm across, and then parry the kick across your body once it's finished. With low kicks, it's a little bit trickier just because it's hard to do the sort of hand switch down there. You can take the low kick and catch it on the thigh, pull it up to your hip, and then step straight in, or step back and swing them across your body. But it's just not as clean. The greatest counter to the low kick in IMHO, in my humble opinion, is it honest opinion or humble? I think it's humble opinion, but mine certainly isn't. But the best way to counter a low kick is to step in with the right straight up the centre, because not only do you have a great chance of knocking them on their arse, even if you don't knock them out, even if they're still completely conscious, if you hit them even in the chest or something when they're on one leg, you can follow them to the floor and keep hitting them in MMA. And in kickboxing, you've got a great chance of getting a knockdown and win the round. But additionally, that it's the worst possible time to get caught. Great guys like Peter Ayats have been caught with the right hand on one leg and knocked out by worse fighters. Like I think it was Stefan Leko knocked him out with the right hand straight down the centre when he was stepping up for a kick. But it also puts the fear of that in them. If you can threaten that, guys are a little bit more reluctant about just spamming the low kicks. The other good one is to take the low kick on the thigh. Say they throw a right low kick into your lead left leg. You point your knee out to meet it. You lean heavy onto your front leg so that it hits you in the quad. That's one sort of trick about taking low kicks. Much better to take it in the front of the quad than in the side of the leg, especially if you've been doing your squats for the thots. But take it on the front of the quad and then leap back in with the left hook. That's the Roman Zentsov fashion counter. But in like a pure kickboxing context, the best way to deal with low kicks is just to be willing to teep, like just push kick a lot. Even just little nudges. If you watch good Thais, they make it very hard for each other to get set up to kick properly. So you're throwing out like these fast kicks that aren't quite as hard, because if you telegraph your intentions, you're just going to get nudged over. And getting nudged over on one leg is really annoying because at no point in a fight is it comfortable to be off balance. You're going to freak out about whether the guy's going to run in on you, even if he's not going to. It's a very easy way to sort of frustrate people and tire them out even a little. If you can just nudge people midway through their kicks, that always works well too. I'm a big fan of withdrawing the lead leg, which is, that's moving away from the strike, but you only withdraw the lead leg to the rear leg. So, you've got to do it at the right distance, but if you withdraw the lead leg to the rear leg as they kick, whichever side they're doing, you are in like a nice square stance. So you don't have huge power off either leg, but you've got about equal power off either leg. So you throw back into whichever side is the open side. Or you pause for a second, knowing that they're going to recover, and then the other side will be the open side, which is a great way to do that. Or you can just withdraw the lead leg and then come back in immediately with a push kick. And if you do that a couple of times, like a really hard, this is Sparta teep, you can then pick the knee up and try and turn it over for a Brazilian kick, which is sort of like going down the rabbit hole with counters into counter setups and things. But anyway, I hope that helps. Cheers. Hi, Jack. I've recently started reading Mike Tyson's Undisputed Truth, and it has me thinking, is it better for a coach to have one-star pupil like Tyson/Cuss, TJ/Ludwig, DJ/Matt Hume, all come to mind instantly, or is it better to be part of a super camp, Jones/Jackson Wink, ATT, etc., etc.? Is there any other crazy coach matched with an equally nuts student? I feel that would be a cool history episode. I know you've already done one on Cuss, but something like that. I'll try not to make the question too long, but anything you could add would be much appreciated. Thanks for the podcast from your Patreon boy, Dylan. Cheers, Dylan. I think it's always sort of a mix, because very few of these guys are actually the sole student of their guy. That happened a bit more in boxing, particularly in places with big boxing communities like New York, because if you just wanted to take one guy, like say Charlie Goldman, later in his career when he was working pretty much almost exclusively with Rocky Marciano, I believe, you could go somewhere like Stillman's Gym, which had people like Ray Arcel and all the best coaches and boxers in New York were doing work there. Whereas nowadays, a coach will tend to own his gym in MMA, and it's really more of a camp thing. Like you gave the example of DJ versus Matt Hume, but really that's just Johnson sort of overshadowing Matt Hume's other students. Matt Hume's worked with guys like Josh Barnett. He transformed Hayato Sakurai back in the day, who is a tremendous fighter. If anyone's listening and hasn't watched Hayato Sakurai's career, definitely worth a watch. He came onto the scene as this big punching grappler who really was terrific on the ground. He'd like cartwheel past people just because he didn't give a shit. And then he went to ADCC and got second in the absolute without much difficulty at all. And then he sort of had this career drop off. Reinvented himself as a lightweight, went to America to train with Matt Hume, and Matt Hume taught him to kickbox, and he suddenly came back and he's just hitting dudes in the liver all the time. Bas Rutten is jizzing himself on commentary. Very interesting transformation, and sort of like like people talk about Floyd Patterson being the prototype for Tyson. It's sort of a little bit like a prototype for DJ. Also excelling off that double collar tie with the knees and things like that. But, even when we talk about DJ now, Matt Hume has a camp of fighters, and DJ's favorite training partner is Bibiano Fernandez, who you really don't know about, don't hear about as much nowadays because he's making easy money with one. One is I don't like one. I've decided because they give these guys money to fight nobodies, and they just sort of eat up their career, like what they've done with Ben Askren. And you're not going to say no to money to for fighting nobodies, but it does mean that you just sort of get forgotten. Bibiano Fernandez was very, very good for a very long time. And the fact that he trains with DJ daily is probably why both of them are so good. TJ Ludwig's a little bit more interesting. Ludwig still has a camp full of people, but he's made it very clear that he's focusing on his one-to-one relationship with TJ. But then he's got his own coaches who help the rest of the team. So yeah, that's intriguing. But it does also mean that Ludwig is always getting in interesting people like Takeru, or going and finding a way to have TJ spar with Lomachenko and stuff like that. There's always someone interesting on their Instagram. But Tyson Cuss is another example. Cuss was still training loads of guys. He had a troop, basically, of boys who he would adopt, or rather look after, troubled boys, and teach them to box. And he was teaching out of an old gym above a police station, I think, in the end. He had a few guys who he was working with at any time. It was just that Tyson excelled. He'd had previous champions. He'd had Floyd Patterson and Jose Torres. And even just before Tyson came along, he had Teddy Atlas and Kevin Rooney. Both were working under him, training. Atlas then got hurt and ended up cornering for Rooney when Rooney was still fighting. I think the thing to remember is that all these guys have people to work with. Even Tony Ferguson in his weird camp up in the middle of nowhere, he's still bringing in bodies to work with, None of these guys are doing it on their own. You just don't tend to hear about the camps as much when we're talking about history and we're romanticizing the relationship between coach and student. I think if I were training up as a young fighter, I would probably, in this sport, well, what I do as a hobbyist is I find the best gyms that I can train at in England, and I try and train at them as often as I can. But I think I would find the places that produce the best people most frequently, because you've got a good roster of guys to spar with. There is clearly something being done there that is making consistently good guys, even if they're not making one world beater and then sort of going into obscurity. I think that's probably best for most people, unless you are incredibly lucky and find some Charlie Goldman figure who is an old trainer who's decided to pack it all in, but then comes out because they see your physical potential. I think if you're just a normal person wanting to or a normal fighter wanting to try and get as good as you can, just find good bodies to spar with. Anyway, cheers, Dylan. Right, there's no fights this weekend. Well, there is PFL and, whatever. But we'll be back next week to talk about stuff that's happening, probably some kickboxing or something like that. And just to wrap, so if you want to send a question, you've got a really good chance of getting it answered. fightsgonepodcast@gmail.com. If you want to support the podcast and get in on the history episodes, join the Patreon. I have half a K1 recorded, but I am pretty much done on my Opium War stuff, so I'm going to start recording that too, and then just see whichever one comes out in the next week. And if you want to keep up with what I'm doing, head to thefightprimer.com. Probably a little bit more important now because I'm doing stuff for both Vice and Unibet. I'm your boy Jack Slack. This has been the Fights Gone By podcast, and I will catch you next week. Can you imagine what TJ would have done to DJ though?